was distinctive about fascist imperialism, and how did it differ from other forms of imperial conquest and rule? Pamela Ballinger's paper examines the three-axis empires through the lens of excess, and in doing so reveals key characteristics that set them apart from other imperial juggernauts past and present. One can instantly see why Pam highlighted excess. There's something about it that immediately rings true, given the bombast of fascist rhetoric, the hopes, energy, and capital the fascist regimes invested in empires, the brutal violence that was at heart of so many fascist endeavors, and paradoxically, the mercifully short-lived nature of fascist expansionism, which lent it an explosive incandescence. I'm thinking here of excess as something tantamount to radicality or extremism, with violence never far from view. But Pam takes the word excess well beyond what we expect, capturing first the predicament of Italy, Germany, and Japan as remnants. We are invited to recognize the ways in which they were left over, or we might say left out, relegated to the sidelines by the imperial excesses of other powers, Great Britain, France, Germany, and the US. All three Axis powers were so-called latecomer states, their dismay at having been late to the imperial game aggravated by a new sense of grievance after having been denied the spoils of World War I. This perception, in turn, encouraged the view that their pursuits were more justified and even more virtuous than those of the hegemonic empires, though it is in fact the case that all empires, not just the fascist ones, think of themselves as better than the others. Excess as leftover enables Pam to identify something historically distinctive that set these empires apart and figured prominently in their imagination, and that was later picked up by historians to explain Italy's, Germany's, and Japan's particular paths following the First World War. Secondly, Pam invokes the abundance of imperial models at the disposal of these latecomers as they sought violently to make their way in the world. True, having an excess of imperial models to choose from may not have set Italy, Germany, and Japan apart from other empires, but the model they all chose possibly did. When confronted with the option of emigrant versus the territorial colonies, both Italy and Japan opted for the territorial model, though admittedly, at least in the Italian case, this decision was made before fascism was a thing, and the regime doubled down only after immigration was foreclosed by receiving countries. Germany's choice was somewhat different between conquest in Africa and in Eastern Europe. The fact that the Nazis chose the East made their empire readily accessible, more secure, and more suitable for German settlement, at least in their eyes. Settlement was key for Italy and Japan too, as territorial control offered the possibility of retaining and commanding settlers rather than losing emigrants or having to continually appeal to their loyalty. Faced with options, they all chose the model that promised to safeguard territorial dominance and maximize possibilities for settler expansion. Thirdly, we see the multiplicity of imperial forms the Axis empires constructed and practiced, though here too Pam acknowledges that other empires also ruled over diverse lands and populations by applying different systems of governance and accepting different legal codes. Like other empires, the fascist ones invested much energy into conjuring up an imperial past, present, and future, and projected it onto their imperial space, while colonial subjects employed their own temporalities to make sense of their conquerors. But also here, Pam's discussion of the Axis empires enables us to start seeing some characteristics that we may want to discuss as distinctively fascist approaches to empire: settler colonialism, corporativism, and autarky. We then turn to the ways in which Italy, Germany, and Japan surpassed what had existed before, in the sense of both claimed or actual innovation. For example, the quest not just for imperial possession, but to establish a new world order. the strict limitations they put on movement into and within their imperial spaces, the emphasis on agriculture, the lavish pursuit of public work projects, and their obsession with the avoidance of waste. Finally, we arrive at the discussion of the meaning of excess with which I began, namely radicality and norm infringement. Deploying this panoply of meanings enables Pam to discuss the Axis powers' place in the world order, their self-perception and ambition, the choices they confronted and the policies they pursued. Most originally, in her conclusions, she posits excess as the Axis powers' guiding principle. So rich and suggestive as all this is, the, shall we say, excess of excesses raises questions in its own rights. Used subversively, the word excess becomes less a syndrome or a defining condition than an invitation to explore, leaving us still to pin down what it is that makes fascist imperialism distinctive, if it indeed is distinctive. Pam's artful deployment of the term, I think, actually reveals something that is the reverse of excess, namely a kind of restraint that characterizes our current historiographical moment. A justified concern that in trying to nail down a core set of defining fascism criteria, we will create something that is sterile and schematic and fail to do justice to the rich and elusive variety of fascisms in the world. Put another way, such a multi-pronged excess stands for a kind of retrenchment, an aversion to a revived fascist minimum. I think Pam Isuel of a laundry list aligns with our current historiographical moment. But at the risk of drawing up a new laundry list, I would say that we cannot speak of the imperialism of these three powers without foregrounding the distinct practices that have emerged in Pam's analysis. Wars of conquest that challenge the world order, settler colonialism, agricultural fantasies, heavy state involvement, and I would add strict, centrally regulated racial hierarchies. No discussion of fascist imperialism can avoid concentrating on these. In drawing our attention to these fascist practices, I do not seek to elicit agreement on a number of immobile traits, but to recognize that in a world with particular constraints, Italy, Germany, and Japan all chose to move forward in similar ways, pursued similar goals, identified similar enemies, and ended up fighting the same war. I also do not mean to say that many of the key characteristics of fascist empire hadn't played any role in relation to the other, shall we call them, liberal empires. We might say, though it is certainly not the whole picture, that what is distinctive about fascist empires is not what they did, but when they did it. At a time when the liberal empires were seeking to establish their benign credentials as tutors of future independent nations, the old-style expansionism of the fascist powers looked out of place. We shouldn't overdo this point, even in the past, to the degree that liberal empires had anticipated fascist practices. They had often been accompanied by other preoccupations, such as trans-imperial trade, relations with other world powers, and international institutions, which they admittedly controlled, and collaborations with colonial elites that had few fascist analogues. But it is certainly most significant that whatever parallels there had been, the liberal empires looked very different from their fascist counterparts in the interwar period. And it is to this question of temporality and periodization that I would now like to turn. Despite the continued existence of empires, the aftermath of the First World War was a proclaimed age of nation. In the age of Wilsonian rhetoric and the League of Nations, the legitimacy and sturdiness of empire itself was now in question. All the powers with territorial aspirations in the interwar period, the Soviet Union, the US, and as well as the fascist powers, would therefore seek new ways of defining, defending, and legitimating territorial acquisition. Hitler rejected the colonial politics of the past and thought a new Bodenpolitik of the future, The Japanese wanted something that was post-imperial and pan-Asian, even while seeking to secure world power by transforming the new territory of Manchukuo. And Mussolini similarly imagined a new kind of empire, an empire of labor, and an empire that, in the case of Libya, could become an extended Italian nation with its new inhabitants, a new kind of citizen. Italy, Germany, and Japan responded to the moment in similar fashion, and it is well possible that their choices reinforced each other, inspired and egged each other on, as some studies have already shown, though certainly more work is necessary here. So I do think Pam's temporal excess is key. As I read her account, the different kinds of excess that she adduces are not tightly linked, except by a common excessivity that for her emerges as a fascist empire's underlying characteristics. But I think we could add that the idea of fascist imperialism as temporal remnant is directly linked to the radicalism of fascist imperialism, and indeed that their intertwining lies at the heart of what is specific about fascist empire. Because on the one hand, the fascist powers knew that they were out of step with the global zeitgeist, even if they decried the swindle and hypocrisy of the League of Nations. They ruthlessly doubled down on their right to lead, to acquire, to control. On the other hand, precisely because the international legitimacy of their projects was contested, and Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union were all arming rapidly from the mid-1930s onward, all the fascist powers were in a terrific hurry, gambling on establishing new geopolitical facts before the world was in a position to prevent them. Securing new empire in the age of nations necessitated the most brutal imperial conquest and repression, to use Pam's language, and excessification. Obviously, there's a chicken and egg question here. Was the brutality and radicalism of fascist empire a response to the conundrum of establishing world power status in the conditions of the interwar period? Or was the willingness to break with the new global conventions a sign of their inherent brutality and radicalism? Pam's notion that excess was fascism's guiding principle is suggestive here, reminding us that all three major fascist powers saw radical male cohorts, Michael Wild's generations of the unbound, willing to suspend all convention in pursuit of power. Obviously, here we are leaving the specific terrain of empire. As Pam reminds us, what most struck some insightful observers after the war was not so much the way the fascists did empire, but rather the way they brought imperial violence back home. Perhaps the most exceeded the presidents of their neighbors in terms of what they did in the homelands as opposed to the colonies. Persuasive as it is, the notion of excess thus unavoidably raises the question for us of the distinctiveness not only of fascist empires, but of fascism more generally.